There's a specific kind of confidence certain people carry into every relationship, every friendship, every family dynamic. A quiet, unspoken certainty that no matter how badly they behave, no matter how much they take without giving back, you'll always be there. Not because they've earned that permanence, because they've simply never had to imagine its absence. This is the exact confidence that made them careless with you. And this is exactly the confidence your absence is about to destroy. If you've recently walked away, quietly, completely, without a dramatic scene, without the closure they assumed they were entitled to, you're probably still waiting for something to feel different. You're still checking, in small, unconscious ways, whether this decision actually mattered to anyone besides yourself. And I need you to understand something today that's going to change how you see everything that happens next. Your absence is not a small thing they'll barely register. It is about to become one of the most disorienting experiences of their life, and they have absolutely no idea it's coming. Let's talk about why. Somewhere in the psychology of people who take others for granted, and this applies whether we're talking about a narcissistic partner, a self-absorbed friend, a family member who spent years treating your patience as an infinite resource. There exists a fundamental miscalculation. They mistake your consistency for your limitlessness. They confuse the fact that you've always shown up with the assumption that you always will, regardless of how you're treated, regardless of what they take without replacing it, regardless of how invisible your own needs become in the process of meeting theirs. This miscalculation isn't usually conscious. It's rarely something they'd admit to, even to themselves, if you ask them directly whether they believed you'd tolerate absolutely anything indefinitely. But their behavior reveals the belief anyway, because people don't treat things they believe are fragile the way they treat things they believe are unbreakable. And for years, sometimes decades, you were treated like something unbreakable, pushed, tested, taken from again and again without any real consequence ever following. This is precisely why your absence lands so differently than they expect, because they weren't just losing your presence, they were losing an assumption about reality itself, the assumption that you were a permanent fixture, a stable variable in their life that would remain constant no matter what other chaos they introduced around it. When that assumption collapses, it doesn't just create an empty space where you used to be. It creates a crisis of understanding, forcing them to confront a version of reality they'd never actually prepared for because they never believed it was possible. Here's what almost nobody explains about this specific kind of disorientation, and it's crucial to understanding why your absence becomes so much more powerful than any confrontation could ever be. When someone loses access to a person they've quietly, unconsciously depended on for emotional regulation, validation, or a sense of stability, they don't just miss that person. They lose access to an entire internal system they'd built around that person's presence, often without ever realizing how much of their own functioning depended on something they'd stopped consciously appreciating years earlier. Think about what you actually provided, even if neither of you ever named it directly. You were the person who remembered important details they'd forgotten. You were the one who managed the emotional undercurrents of family gatherings, smoothing over tension before it became a full eruption. You were the steady presence they could return to after every explosive argument, every unreasonable demand, every moment of cruelty they never had to fully account for because you kept absorbing the aftermath and moving forward anyway. None of this labor was visible to them in the moment, precisely because it worked so well. Good systems, when they're functioning properly, become invisible to the people benefiting from them. You don't think about the foundation of a house until it starts to crack. You don't think about the person managing your emotional world until that person simply stops showing up to do it anymore. This is why the first days and weeks after your absence often produce something that looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. They don't immediately fall apart. They don't immediately reach out in devastated apology. This is often deeply confusing, even painful, for the person who left, because some part of you was hoping, despite everything, that your absence would matter instantly, visibly, undeniably. But absence doesn't work that way. It works slowly, the way structural damage works, invisible at first, accumulating quietly beneath the surface, until enough time has passed that the cracks finally become impossible to ignore. During this early period, what's actually happening inside them is something closer to denial than indifference, even though the two can look remarkably similar from the outside. They're operating according to old patterns, old assumptions, waiting for the natural correction they've always relied on before, waiting for you to reach out first, waiting for the relationship to resume its familiar rhythm the way it always has, waiting for the discomfort of your absence to simply resolve itself the way discomfort always has in the past, through your predictable return. This waiting period is where so much of the real internal shift begins to take shape, even though it produces almost no visible external signs. Because every day that passes without your return chips away, slowly, at the foundational assumption that made them careless with you in the first place. Every week that passes reinforces something they've never had to process before, that permanence was never actually guaranteed, that your presence was never actually unconditional, that somewhere along the way, without any dramatic warning, they lost access to something they'd assumed would always simply be there. And here's where the disorientation truly begins to intensify, because once this realization starts to fully land, once the denial can no longer hold against the accumulating evidence of your genuine absence, they're forced to confront something most people who take others for granted have spent their entire lives successfully avoiding: the reality of their own impact. For as long as you remained present, no matter how much pain accompanied that presence, they never had to fully reckon with what their behavior actually cost. Every consequence got absorbed, managed, softened by your continued willingness to stay, to forgive, to show up again despite everything. Your absence removes that buffer completely. For the first time, possibly in their entire life, they're forced to sit with the unfiltered reality of what happens when someone finally, completely stops absorbing the cost of their behavior on their behalf. This confrontation is genuinely destabilizing in a way that goes far beyond simply missing you as a person. It forces a reckoning with self-image, with identity, with every story they've told themselves about who they are and how they treat the people who love them. Because if you were willing to leave permanently without the drama they always assumed would accompany any real threat of departure, then something about their understanding of themselves, their relationships, and their own behavior has to be fundamentally uncomfortably wrong. Most people, faced with this kind of confrontation, don't immediately arrive at genuine accountability. That would require a level of self-awareness and humility that takes most people considerable time, if they ever develop it at all. What happens first, almost universally, is something messier, more defensive, more focused on managing the discomfort of this realization rather than genuinely understanding it. But underneath whatever defensive reaction comes first, the anger, the blame, the rewriting of history to make your departure seem unreasonable or sudden, rather than the inevitable result of years of accumulated harm. Something has already permanently shifted. They now know something they didn't know before. They know that permanence isn't guaranteed. They know that patience has limits, even when those limits took years to finally reach. They know, on some level, they may spend years trying to suppress or explain away that they are capable of losing people they assumed they'd never have to work to keep. This knowledge doesn't disappear, no matter how they try to manage or minimize it. It becomes a permanent feature of their internal landscape, quietly reshaping how they understand every relationship that comes after you, whether they ever consciously connect the dots back to your specific departure or not. And this is only the beginning of what your absence is about to teach them, because what happens next in the months that follow reveals something even more profound about exactly how deeply your absence rewrites the assumptions they. As the weeks stretch into months, something begins happening that almost nobody prepares you for when you imagine what leaving might accomplish. Because the fantasy most people carry quietly is that absence will produce a clean, satisfying transformation, that the person who took you for granted will finally understand, finally grow, finally become someone genuinely different, motivated by the pain of losing you. This fantasy is understandable, and it's almost never how it actually unfolds, at least not in the way you might hope. What actually happens is messier, slower, and far less oriented around you specifically than you might expect, even though your absence remains the catalyst for everything that follows. Because here's what most people who've spent years taking someone for granted discover: once enough time has passed for genuine reflection to finally break through the initial defensiveness. The reckoning isn't really about you, it's about them. It's about a version of themselves they've never had to look at directly, because your presence, your patience, your endless capacity to absorb consequence always gave them an escape route from ever having to see it clearly. This is where your absence begins doing something even more significant than simply teaching them they can lose people. It begins forcing a confrontation with the actual architecture of how they relate to everyone, not just you. Because the patterns that made them careless with you, the assumption of permanence, the failure to reciprocate, the quiet expectation that someone else would always absorb the emotional labor they refused to do themselves, those patterns didn't exist in isolation. They were operating in every relationship, every dynamic, every interaction throughout their entire life, simply less visibly, because you were the one holding so much of it together without ever being fully acknowledged for the weight you carried. Once you're gone, that weight doesn't simply disappear. It has to go somewhere, and often it starts landing visibly in other relationships they'd previously managed to keep functioning, at least on the surface, precisely because you were quietly absorbing so much of the friction elsewhere. Friends who never seemed to have issues with them before start pulling back, confused by behavior that feels suddenly more exposed without you there to soften it. Family members who always assumed you'd manage the difficult conversations find themselves confronting this person directly for the first time, without your buffer standing between them and the consequences of their own actions. This is one of the most quietly devastating aspects of what your absence sets into motion, because it means the disorientation doesn't stay contained to missing you specifically. It spreads slowly into every corner of their life that depended more than they ever realized on your presence functioning as an invisible, stabilizing force. And as this spreading happens, something begins to crack open that goes beyond simple grief over losing you. It becomes something closer to an identity crisis, a forced confrontation with the possibility that the person they believed themselves to be, reasonable, likable, easy to be in relationship with, was never actually accurate, and was only ever sustainable because someone else was doing the work of making it appear that way. This is precisely the moment where genuine transformation, if it's ever going to happen at all, either begins or definitively fails to begin. And here's what's crucial to understand about this fork in the road, because it explains why some people who lose an empath eventually do change in meaningful ways, while others simply calcify further into the exact patterns that caused the loss in the first place. For genuine transformation to occur, someone has to be willing to sit with the discomfort of this confrontation rather than immediately defending against it. This requires a kind of humility that many people, especially those with deeply entrenched patterns of taking others for granted, simply don't possess, at least not without significant additional pain forcing the issue further. Some people, faced with the full weight of what your absence reveals about them, retreat further into defensiveness, constructing increasingly elaborate justifications for why your departure was unreasonable, unfair, or somehow evidence of your flaws rather than theirs. This path leads nowhere productive, and it typically results in the same patterns simply repeating themselves in whatever relationships come next, with whoever is unfortunate enough to become the next person absorbing consequences that were never actually theirs to carry. But for others, something different happens, something that genuinely qualifies as transformation rather than simply temporary discomfort followed by a return to old patterns. This transformation usually begins with a specific kind of grief that goes beyond simply missing you, extending into genuine mourning for the relationship they could have had if they'd been capable, at the time, of showing up the way the relationship actually required. This grief is different from self-pity, though it can look similar from the outside. It involves genuinely reckoning with what was lost, not because losing you was inconvenient, but because losing you revealed exactly how much they failed to appreciate something genuinely valuable while they still had consistent access to it. This kind of grief, when it's genuine rather than performed, tends to produce visible changes in how someone approaches every subsequent relationship, even if you never witness those changes directly. It shows up as increased capacity for accountability without immediate defensiveness. It shows up as a new willingness to notice and name their own patterns before those patterns cause the same kind of accumulated damage they caused with you. It shows up sometimes as genuine therapy, genuine self-reflection, genuine effort to understand why they operated the way they did for so long, effort that would have been completely unavailable to them while your presence still allowed them to avoid ever fully confronting it. Here's what's important to understand about this transformation, though, especially if some part of you is still hoping it might eventually lead back to you. This growth, when it happens, rarely happens in time to save the relationship it was actually caused by. This is one of the cruelest ironies embedded in this entire dynamic. The very absence required to produce genuine transformation is usually also the thing that makes reconciliation, in most cases, either impossible or genuinely unwise, even once real change has occurred. Because by the time someone has done the actual work required to become capable of the relationship you always deserved, you've usually moved considerably further along your own path of healing, building a life that no longer requires their transformation in order to feel complete. This isn't tragic in the way it might initially seem. It's actually one of the most important parts of this entire process, because it means your absence accomplished something far more valuable than simply teaching them a lesson they might eventually apply to someone else. It gave you the space and time to build something entirely your own, something that doesn't depend on their growth, their accountability, or their eventual understanding of what they lost in order to feel genuinely whole. People who've walked away from relationships like this, the quiet hope, however unwanted, however much you've tried to talk yourself out of it, that your absence might eventually produce a version of them capable of coming back and finally loving you the way you always deserved. I need to address this directly because it's one of the most important truths buried inside this entire conversation, and it's the piece that actually determines whether your absence becomes a source of genuine freedom or simply another form of waiting disguised as moving on. Your absence was never actually about producing their transformation. Even though transformation is often exactly what happens, even though everything we've discussed today describes a real, consistent psychological process that unfolds in people who lose someone they took for granted, that transformation was never the point of your leaving, and it cannot be the reason you continue measuring the success of your own healing. Because here's the trap waiting for anyone who leaves and then spends months or years quietly tracking through mutual friends, through social media, through whatever indirect information trickles back to them, whether the person they left has finally grown into someone worthy of return. This tracking keeps you tethered to them just as completely as staying would have, just through a different mechanism. You're no longer physically present in their life, but your healing has become contingent on their transformation anyway, which means you've never actually left in the way that matters most. Real freedom, the kind your absence is actually capable of producing for you specifically, has nothing to do with whether they eventually change. It has nothing to do with whether they finally understand what they lost, finally develop genuine accountability, finally become capable of the relationship you always deserved. Real freedom means your own healing, your own life, your own sense of wholeness stops being contingent on anything happening on their side of this equation at all. This is the piece so many people miss when they focus entirely on what their absence does to the person who took them for granted, however satisfying that focus might feel in the early stages of separation. Because while everything we've discussed today about their disorientation, their reckoning, their potential transformation is genuinely true and genuinely happening, none of it should become the foundation of your own continued healing. Their transformation, if it happens, belongs to them. Their grief, if it's genuine, belongs to them. Their potential growth into someone capable of real intimacy belongs entirely to their own journey, one that you no longer need to witness, track, or wait for in order to build a genuinely whole life of your own. This is where your absence ultimately becomes most powerful, not through what it does to them, but through what it finally allows you to reclaim. Because for as long as you remained present, absorbing consequence after consequence, managing emotional labor that was never fairly distributed, your own growth remained permanently secondary to managing their comfort. Your absence doesn't just remove you from their life, it returns you completely to your own. This is what actually deserves your attention now, more than any speculation about whether they finally learned their lesson, whether they think about you late at night, whether they've finally become capable of showing up the way you always needed them to. Because even if all of that is true, even if everything we've described today is happening exactly as predicted, your job was never to wait around long enough to witness it. Your job now is building something entirely new, something that doesn't require their transformation as a prerequisite for your own happiness. It's discovering who you are when you're not managing someone else's emotional regulation, absorbing someone else's consequences, holding together a stability that was never fairly reciprocated. It's learning what your own needs actually feel like, unfiltered by years of prioritizing someone else's comfort above your own basic well-being. They may never expect your absence to change them forever. But here's the truth that ultimately matters more than anything happening on their side of this story. Your absence was always going to change you forever, too. Not because you were teaching them a lesson, not because you were waiting for eventual vindication, not because you needed proof that leaving mattered. Your absence changes you because it finally, permanently returns you to yourself. Whatever happens in their internal world now, whatever reckoning, whatever grief, whatever slow, painful transformation might eventually unfold on their side of this story, belongs entirely to them. It was never actually the point. It was never actually what you needed in order to heal. What you needed was simply this: to finally, completely choose yourself. And in walking away, quietly, without waiting for permission or explanation, or the closure you were never actually owed, that's exactly what you already did. They may spend years wondering what happened to the person who used to be there for everything. But you already know. You didn't disappear. You finally, completely arrived, built their entire identity around.